Aloha and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Got Your Six podcast. This six-question podcast brings together high performers to share their methods, strategies, and ideas, delivered in an informative and, most importantly, actionable way that'll help you lead yourself and those around you from the battlefield to the boardroom. Coming to you every episode, I'm your host, Tony Nash. And into the breach.
Nothing mentioned on this podcast is an endorsement or opinion of the Department of Defense.
I got your six, we got your back. Got your six, we got your back. Got your six, we got your back. I got your six.
Sixers, what an unbelievable treat. Like, I'm literally pulling my hair out, almost looking like a mad scientist on this one, which is fitting for our guest. When you think, and I guess the best way to plan for the future, you need to live in the present. And I think that's the best way to kind of describe our guest today. Luke Shabro is here. Luke, thank you so much for coming on the Got Your Six podcast.
Tony, I can't thank you enough for having me on. You've had some incredible guests, so I hope I can just live up to any level of what they have.
We already know this is going to be a loon shot and you're going to raise the bar. You are literally a mad scientist. Like, that is your job. That is in your job title.
Yeah, it's kind of funny because the program is really a tongue-in-cheek kind of name that we started, and I'm not actually a scientist or an engineer. We work with tons of scientists and engineers, but we started as kind of a tongue-in-cheek thing, and then people just loved it, and so it continues to spread. But I am experienced in the softest of sciences because my master's is in political science.
And you were also an Intel instructor in the Navy as well. So you're bringing in those like soft skills into what is usually considered like hard sciences and stuff like that as you look to the future of what's happening inside of the DoD. Yeah,
absolutely. I think sometimes the soft skills get a little underrated. I think some of my success as an Intel analyst and then as a instructor came from an ability to try and understand people, to understand that communication varies between people and really seeing the forest for the trees. So like I said, we work with a lot of scientists, and there are scientists and engineers who are, have forgotten more than I'll ever know. But sometimes they can get even over specialized, or they can be the most brilliant munition scientist ever, looking at high precision guided munitions and all these great things, but they're not always able to see that forest for the trees and see the holistic kind of bigger picture. So I've always told, even when I was teaching my students and even working with mentoring young analysts now, one of the biggest things I try to tell them is, we're translators. We are translators to take what the Army is trying to do, or depending on whichever branch you're working with at the time, understanding the operational concepts and the constructs and how everything works, and then taking that super technical, scientific, detailed information, intelligence, and then making sense of it for our operators, for our warfighters, for our commanders.
A specialized generalist, some would say. What does that look like, when, especially the communication piece, which I think is so vital, whether it's written, verbal, nonverbal? Where do you go to, or kind of where do you start when you're talking to an Intel analyst or just anyone in general when it comes to communication? What is like the first thing that you kind of open up with?
So I always open up with something that some people kind of consider hippie-ish sometimes, and that's empathy. And so it's always about using empathy to understand where people are coming from. And so when I'm instructing young analysts too, one of the things I say is, like, you have to empathize with commanders, and you have to empathize with the guys and girls who are boots on the ground, and understand their perspective. And then it also stretches even to your adversaries, to your threats. If you don't use empathy to try and figure it out, it doesn't mean you have to feel it. It doesn't mean you have to agree or condone or anything like that. But if you don't try and understand those varying perspectives, you're going to be blinded, and you're only going to see things through your view. And so I kind of start with that a lot of times. And then a lot of times also I try to get to first principles. So what are you trying to achieve from this? Whether it's a quick turn analysis, whether it's a deeper dive analytic product, what are you trying to achieve? Okay, what are we trying to inform? Who are we trying to inform? And it sounds really simple, but sometimes you get on this like linear path going down, the train is just going and there's momentum, and you start to get to, this is the way we've always done it. And you just get so iterative that it doesn't, you never stop to really think, are we doing the right thing? Are we asking the right questions? And so that's where first principles thinking is so important. And I try to, again, preach to analysts. What are we trying to get out of this? What are we trying to achieve? Part of it is beginning with the end in mind, but sometimes you don't want to start with the end. You want to be creative about it and find a place or find an analysis where you're not necessarily coming to preconceived notions. We don't want to get into self-fulfilling prophecies. Right. So it's important to ask again, what are we trying to do here?
So, and that, to be able to get to that point we are now of asking, like, what are we trying to do here? Where did you not ask that question in order to be able to ask that question today? Because there's got to be a moment where you remember and you're like, I needed to ask it here and I didn't.
Yeah, I would say, there was some times throughout my career, and I'll keep it from getting into the secret squirrel realm, but some areas where it seemed like, again, there was a linear path,
yeah,
and this is what everybody expects, and this is what we'll see, and then you have to go, is that really the direction that it's really happening? Or is it because we got into group talk and we started thinking that this is definitely what's happening? And I think, part of that was looking at, if I was looking at it at this big general grand scale, I myself got into the momentum of the global war on terrorism, like everybody else. I spent a lot of my career looking at terrorist organizations, violent extremist organizations, state sponsors, and really just examining this and thinking like, this is the fight of our lives, right? And in many ways, it really was. And it was so defining to a generation of folks, not only in the military, but throughout the national security ecosystem. Absolutely. And, I feel like at that time, maybe I had tunnel vision of thinking, this is the way it is, and we're never going to go back to kind of the large scale conflict that we think about, in World War II, even looking back to the Korean War, which is often way too forgotten, and even the early stages of Vietnam, and even later, parts of conventional warfare where I said, we're never going to get to that again. And I think that was a wake up call to me to not be so myopic and not be so focused on this is the only thing that happens or will happen. And you can get really caught in presentism. And I caution against that even now. I think about China and Russia more than anything else right now, but that doesn't mean that we can't find ourselves in conflict once again with a violent non-state actor, dealing with insurgencies, and these violent movements. And so we can't get so caught up that this is the only thing that will happen.
No, and the other piece too, which I think is very critical, whether you're dealing with future operations in warfare or you're just trying to like look at your goals for the long term, you can't focus on target fixation. It's really understanding the systems that allow you to get to the future. How do you remain focused on the systems? Is there a system that you're working on that you're an absolute beginner in and just trying to understand more? I know those are two questions I kind of in there.
So I think that that's definitely two questions. So one is really looking at exactly what you said. Everything is systems, and we tend to think like in lines of system of systems, which was a big, analytic push especially in the 2000s.
Track all the trackers, yeah,
exactly. Yeah. And that was like informationized warfare. It was like, okay, net centric warfare, and we're looking at systems of systems. But what it's really about is not the technical, scientific, mechanical systems, or where we think about, platforms and things like that, ships, aircraft, and even systems in terms of types of militaries and how they work, but rather thinking about systems, confrontation, and integration. So how do these systems work? Not in terms of, again, those physical material things that we think about, but conceptually overall. How do, because we get focused, analysts so often, you think about the dime spectrum. So for people who don't know, it's diplomatic, information, military, economic, or you'll hear like the longer PME, ZPT and stuff like that. But we get really focused because it's just human nature, and we're, a lot of us are either, veteran or active duty. We get really focused on that M. Everything becomes the big M. And the truth of the matter is, when you look at it, you have to look at the entire operational environment, and there's a whole lot of D, I, and E in that. And so it's about expanding that and understanding that systems confrontation, and that allows you kind of see the bigger picture. In terms of like systems, like new systems, trying to understand, I really think I struggle sometimes, or, it's really new to me, trying to understand aspects of the metaverse, cryptocurrency, blockchain, all those digital, because we're really dealing with like a totally different digital world. This isn't like, some, and it's so strange as a domain when you think about it, because like you start talking to even senior leaders, cyber becomes this ethereal kind of out there nascent thing, and people don't see it, but it actually really touches into our physical world all the time. So it's something that I'm working on trying to understand. And I think that a lot of times for me, what helps when I'm working on looking at a new system like that, or a new concept really, is thinking about it in terms of analogies. And how do you think about analogous learning is really important to me. And one of my favorite books is David Epstein's Range, and how specialists, or excuse me, how generalists thrive in a specialist world. And one of the things that he points out is that idea of analogies, and the ability to take a look at something that is seemingly not all that connected, but realizing there are parallels to understand. And so that's why part of the reason, like, I'm a reading addict is I read not just, I read plenty of military histories and
phenomenal reading list. Like, you're
thank
just
you.
constantly dropping them.
But I try to read not only those military centric, political centric type books, but I'll read straight up, science fiction, of course, but also regular fiction. Read into, I've read books on crows, right? So one of my favorite books is The Gift of Crows, and it talks about the ways in which they learn, the ways in which they adapt, the societies that they build, and you can read different books like that and then start to see parallels, and there's analogies there to understanding these systems, because again, this is very, for someone like me, this is very foreign and new, but ironically, like generationally, it won't matter. Like my kids I got 2 boys, 8 and 11, and they're gonna act like I'm the old man that can't find the mute button on my phone.
What is the analogy that you're using the most? Do you find yourself using the most these days?
I think the analogy I find myself using the most, and maybe to my peril, is usually related to football. I think it's just because I'm a football fanatic, and so I start to look at like how teams are built, how they rise and ascend, how they fall, and different strategies that are used. I think probably because I've looked a lot in the last year and couple of years, and you've seen somewhat in terms of talent management, and really people, because no matter what, the technology changes the character of warfare, but at the heart of it is always the people. And so I think that teams, and I'll look at other sports too as well, but I just think that team building, and how you employ talent and how you find talent, all that stuff is like crazy interesting to me. And so I always kind of compare those things.
So like you're looking at, I mean, like you said, from going from a draft concept all the way to winning a championship and then having to recycle and do it all over again.
Right.
Especially as you look, like you were saying, at operations and warfare. Where have your beliefs or understanding of the future of operations and warfare shifted because you're able to apply these different analogies, which start to then do these like small atomic changes to the way you approach?
Yeah, I think that one of the big changes in my own thinking and viewpoints, I think when I first started in the futures game in 2015. So that's and to an extent when you're an Intel analyst, you're always looking at futures. But I came into it not knowing anything about futures and started looking at it, and I was so enamored with everything that was happening, and it felt like this is a pivotal moment, especially in technology. And I think I was probably at the time, like a lot of people, overly optimistic about what could be done with artificial intelligence, machine learning, autonomy, especially, which I still am, a believer in some aspects of that. And I never bought into the fairy dust of it all, but I really I felt like by 2030, oh man, how many operators on the ground are we really going to need? It's becoming, how much can we actually automate? Because we want robotics to do everything that's dull, dirty, dangerous, right? And we should be able to take the human out of this in so many areas. And I still believe there are definitely critical points where we can do that and we can make ourselves so much better. But just seeing what has not come to fruition, in terms of all the techno optimist promises, what has occurred. I think Russia and Ukraine was obviously very eye opening, and you realize that even though I think those things are definitely going to advance, and we're gonna look at increased levels of robotization, autonomy, and kind of getting mixed formations and things like that, but I started to realize with that again that there was so much still in terms of people. It was always people, no matter what, were always at the heart of it. And you see it right now in Russia, Ukraine, right? So you see Ukrainian, forces, and a lot of people obviously were so surprised that, the Ukrainians were beating back the Russians and, obviously just retook Kherson and, great on them, Slava Ukraini all the way.
Absolutely.
And people were surprised, but I wouldn't say I was, wholly surprised by that, because I had studied and talked to some Ukrainian warfighters, and they had changed. And now, so they've adopted some technologies, and we've seen them employ high Mars systems like that. They've been supplied to great effect. But the biggest thing was they completely revitalized from 2014 and 15, completely revitalized their training, their leadership. That was what matters. And that's been, while materiel certainly matters and logistics certainly matters and national will cannot be understated, but the people and their ability, the Ukrainian warfighters have vastly outperformed Russians, who are, especially when you talk conscripts, they have all of a year of rotation through that system. So people still matter so much. And so the analogy is like, I've looked at football, and there's, there, especially again, like just, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, the push for analytics was huge, right? Like, oh, we got to use analytics, and the smartest guys know when to go, the stats tell them to go for it on, 4th and 2, whatever. And that exists. And I think you have to use that stuff. But the best teams still are the ones with the best people, and not just the talent, but how they utilize them, how they understand, and how they lead. And that's the difference right now, because you can be the smartest whiz kid when it comes to, how to design plays, how to do all this stuff. But if you can't lead people and you can't cultivate talent, then you're going to end up, and I apologize to any Raiders fans out there, but a guy like Josh McDaniels has been looked at as, an offensive genius. Well, it hasn't amounted to anything, because they don't know how to properly utilize, motivate, and lead people.
Right. Yeah. I mean, Jeff Saturday goes in, runs a simple, Very
There you
simple
go.
game plan. And let talent play talent. You're using the P variable, right, of people. And what's fascinating about that is I really want to focus in on the phase change. And since we're talking analogies, right, look at like ice, right, where you have water, gas, in different forms.
Right.
At 29, 28, 30, 31 degrees Fahrenheit, nothing. 32, it starts to melt,
Right.
which is fascinating. So you essentially are living professionally as you look at this stuff at those phase changes and looking at the different changes that can occur under stress and under adversity.
Absolutely. And it's very interesting to look at because it'll never be the same again. Meaning you can look at it and people say hindsight is 2020, and it is, but you can't then look at the past and look at past experience and then just replicate that. So you can't say, well, this didn't work last time, we're going to adjust, and it'll definitely work if we don't do what we did before. Or even worse, is to look at success and just assume that doing the same thing is going to get those successful results again, because that's not how it works. And sometimes success can be more fortuitous than people realize. It can be more to chance than people want to even admit. Another one of my favorite books, it was on Verrall's Think Like a Rocket Scientist. And one of the things that love it, and one of the things that they've tried to do at NASA is really realize that just because something was successful doesn't mean that that's going to happen in the future, because there was avenues or happenstance that could have occurred that would have led to dramatically worse results. And so success can be extremely dangerous. I'm really, sometimes a movie nerd as well. And one of my favorites has always been, because I think about this, again, analogies, but I think about this a lot with the U.S. And it's in the Dark Knight Rises, one of my favorites, and where Bane is fighting Batman. And he grabs his fist and he says, peace has cost you your strength. Victory has defeated you. And wow. I always think about that analogy with the United States, because and the United States military in specifically, because we were so used to, in the sense of succeeding, especially since the 91 Gulf War, and this idea that, okay, yes, we had our struggles in Iraq and Afghanistan, and you can look at the disparity between policy, strategy, operations on the ground, and there's so many other factors. But we always had the idea that, okay, but against a nation state, toe to toe, nobody's ever going to beat us, because we're just so overly capable. If we really put all of our effort into that, there's no way we could be stopped. And I think that's a fallacy. We can't get comfortable with the idea that we've been victorious against state actors in the past, so it'll be no problem.
Yeah, no problem. Where has victory for you ultimately led to a defeat that then you had to kind of look around and then ultimately propel you to victory?
Yeah, I think I'll give kind of a personal anecdote. So I've been coaching youth soccer for the last 6 years, and I have been lucky enough to have I've always had phenomenal kids. I love working with them. And I had never had a losing season before, and we had teams that just absolutely dominated. And I got used to the idea that I could just cycle through, and I knew how to set them up. I knew how to train them. I knew how to condition them, and we would just roll to another great season. And this was the worst season I've ever had. And everything just kind of imploded. I think part of it was, moved up from U10 to U13, and the field expanded and the players expanded, and you had this wide age gap between like my kid who's 11 and 4 foot nothing to like kids that are 13 and like my height. And so I really felt like things kind of just collapsed, and I started to doubt myself as well of, do these kids even like playing for me right now, which is to me important because I want them to enjoy it, not just, it's not just a grind. It's soccer. I want them to have fun, and learn a love of the sport. And I really had to reevaluate the ways I was doing things, who I was listening to, because I think I was too caught up in how I always did things and not listening to changing things up. And when I started to listen midway through the season, or more midway through the season, we started to have a lot more success. And it wasn't, the wins didn't pile up, but we saw this improvement in this gel, and we saw them start to enjoy it so much more. And by the end of it, I was like, man, I wish I had 6 more games, because we would just knock it out of the park. But it was just a learning experience to realize, sometimes, even though you've been so successful in some areas, sometimes it just takes falling flat on your face to realize that you have to adjust your viewpoint. And again, like, it's all about listening to people.
And so then let's talk about you one more time as we kind of wrap up, because we've done 2019 would be proud of us for going range, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
How have you been able to provide empathy to yourself so you're better today than yesterday?
Empathy to myself, about myself, or others?
Both.
Yeah, I think I have a lot of hard time with giving myself grace, in terms of if I mess something up, or make a mistake, or I'm just not able to finish everything that I wanted to. I tend to maybe set my goals too high sometimes, but I feel like if you don't set it that high, then you'll never know how really far you can get. And I tend to beat myself up pretty bad over some of that stuff sometimes. And I started looking at it, and there was a great book that I'd posted about, and it was all about, I think it was called Keeping House While Drowning. And the idea is like, how do you basically just get through the daily grinds of life, when things are just not going how you want it to, and how do you just maintain, and be okay with that. And I read the
I don't
book
know what
because
you've
I
been
wanted
told,
to
Sixers, but the
understand how to
lawyers
be
would like us
more
to remind
efficient
you that
in
the
my daily
views,
life,
opinions, and
and
comments
to
expressed on the
maybe
Got Your Six
develop a better
podcast
system
are solely
for
those
how
of the
to
hosts or
achieve
guests, to
things.
include current
And
and
I'm
previous
talking daily
Department of
things,
Defense
like
employees,
cleaning the
and should in
house,
no way
like
be
making
considered the
sure the
opinions
car,
of or
the car's
endorsements on
oil's
behalf of
changed,
the Department of Defense or
and
any of
getting
its
to that stuff.
components,
And
divisions,
the
contractors,
author
or
noted,
other
like,
current and previous
think
staff
about
members.
your self-talk, and think about, would you say this to even somebody you didn't like? Would you say the things that you say to yourself? I'm, I'm a piece of shit because I didn't finish this aspect of it, some task. Would you say that to anybody else, especially a loved one? So why are you saying it to yourself? So I think I had to learn to empathize with myself and say, you know what, it's okay. Sometimes things just don't go exactly as planned, and you got to learn to, the book was way less about systems than I thought, and it was more about, coping with yourself, and really saying, one of the interesting things she really said was, sometimes you can say, it is okay to be human. And it sounds like really simple, but you can say that and really recognize that it's okay to be human and make mistakes, and not again achieve everything that you try to do all the time. And then when it comes to empathizing with other people, again, I kind of get back to, reading is a big part of it, because it allows me to, I've always said, like, I can only live my life in terms of, cisgender, heterosexual, white male who went up through DOD. That's it. I can't, I can't live any other life. But through reading, I can try to experience and understand at least what other people are going through, who are from different backgrounds, whether it's ethnically, gender, socioeconomic, just understanding people is so important. And then a big part of it to me is, listening, because I think that everybody has a story to tell. Because sometimes, we get caught up, and I have to watch it myself. I'm a jabberjaws. You hear it right now. Like, I'm a chatterbox, and I have to watch.
We could talk for
and
hours. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I have to watch and make sure that I'm actually actively listening to people and not just waiting for my turn to talk. And so I've worked a lot on active listening, because everybody from, sometimes you get people that get overly focused on hero worship, or a certain famous figure that they, study and identify with, and everything they say is just so impactful and insightful. In reality, sometimes I just want to talk to the janitor. Sometimes I want to talk to the person driving my Uber, because they have such an amazing experience to tell me about, and to understand where they're coming from helps me get a wider perspective. And if I don't listen and I don't pay attention to that, then I can't build that empathy, and I'm going to be blind, not just in analysis, but I think in general in life. I want to know what other people are thinking, feeling, and experiencing, so that we can get to, again, sounds very hippie like, but get to that higher plane together, because, it's all a rising tide, brings up all ships. And so that's what I'm looking for, is I want to know what they're experiencing, and let's find common ground. And that's how you get things done, because empathy has been, my biggest key to networking, because I'm not talking to people just to see what I can get out of them. I'm talking to them because I want to see what they need. What do they want? What are they, what are they striving for? And let's do that together.
Absolutely. And as you talk about networking, where can people go to find out more about not only what you're doing, but more about the Mad Scientist Initiative and everything else that you just
so anybody can find me on LinkedIn. Just look for Luke Shabro. I'm probably far too active on there. And then, but for Mad Sci, we do have an official LinkedIn page. So just look Army Mad Scientist, but also at Army Mad Sci for Twitter and Instagram. And then if you go to our blog site, the Mad Scientist Laboratory, so it's Mad Sci sorry, got to make sure I get this right. It's Mad Sci blog. Hold on, Tony.
We're going to make sure we also link it in the show notes below.
Yes.
So not to worry.
Sorry, I'm like.
So you were in it.
I always know this by heart, and then I was like, wait a second. You can edit this out, right?
Mm-hmm. This isn't a live one.
Good God, I've repeated it. So, okay. All right. So, so they can check out the blog, the Mad Scientist Laboratory. So it's madsciblog.tradoc.army.mil. And the big thing is we want to hear from everybody. That's, one of the things I love about working on this program, is that we are trying to engage everybody and harness the intellect of the nation. We always say we're not a community of interest, we're not a community of practice, we're a community of action. And so we want people to get involved, because again, we want to hear those perspectives. Mad Sci Lab, the blog, over half of those submissions that we publish are guest submissions, because it's not about hearing ourselves talk. It's about getting all those varying ideas and divergent ideas in.
And we appreciate you today, Luke, allowing us to hear your story as you shared it with us, your tactics, your methods, your strategies, and most importantly, thanks for having our six.
Oh, thanks, Tony. I can't thank you enough again. I love the podcast. You've had some incredible guests, so just honored to be among them all.
Thank you, my man.
I don't know what you've been told, Sixers, but the lawyers would like us to remind you that the views, opinions, and comments expressed on the Got Your Six podcast are solely those of the hosts or guests, to include current and previous Department of Defense employees, and should in no way be considered the opinions of or endorsements on behalf of the Department of Defense or any of its components, divisions, contractors, or other current and previous staff members.